I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review, and this is the Book Review Podcast. Given my job, I should hypothetically be reading all the time. And I am, though I have a very broad definition of reading, one that very specifically includes audiobooks. I live in the suburbs now, and I listen to a lot of audiobooks while driving, while walking to my commuter train station, while washing the dishes, while doing the laundry, while lamenting the fact that I no longer live in the city, which is very much my own thing. On this episode, I'm joined by two book review editors who also listen to a ton of audiobooks. Tina Jordan, a regular guest here, and Lauren Christensen, who in addition to many other things, is our audiobook maven. The three of us talk about what makes for a good audiobook narrator, what speed we listen to them at, and some of our favorites. Let's turn to that conversation now. Lauren Christensen, welcome to the podcast. It's been quite a while since we've had your voice on. It's so good to see you here.
You too. Thanks so much for having me.
Hi, Tina.
Hi, Gilbert.
Lauren, one of the reasons I wanted to have this conversation between the three of us is because you've been working on something over the past couple months that is a fun experiment, and it has to do with audiobooks. It's called Audiobook of the Week. I was wondering, before we jump into a larger conversation about audiobooks, if you could let us know, why are we doing this and how has our audiobook coverage changed a bit this year?
I'm really excited about the new series that we're running. As you said, it's weekly short standalone audiobook reviews. Previously, we've done more kind of roundup style, column style, sometimes under various themes. This is going to be very much, so far, I think we've run 4 or 5, so it's still very much a work in progress. But so far, I think we're thinking to cast as wide a net as possible from our own listening and from just what we know of our friends and just people who we observe. The audiobook listeners fall into multiple categories. I think there are people who just want to read a book, but their lifestyle or their habits make an audiobook version of that narrative the most accessible to consume, if it's someone who has a long commute or whatever it is. And then there are certain audiobooks that are actually just, for some reason, there's a compelling reason to listen to it in your ear as opposed to reading it. It might be a production value. It might be a specific reader. And so there are a lot of different reasons to go to an audiobook. And that is what makes it really fun to pick one every single week. And we're trying to, as I said, cast a wide net, some fiction, some nonfiction, some author narrated, some cast narrated, to really run the gamut and try to get as many readers and consumers of narratives as possible.
So you said readers in reference to audiobooks.
Yeah.
Before we get too far in this conversation, I just want to touch on a debate, maybe, although I don't really think it's a debate anymore, about whether or not audiobooks count as reading. And while by the strict definition that you would find in the dictionary, reading and listening are two different things, I think there are some people maybe that see these two things as not necessarily the same. Where do you fall on that line?
I think the question is, it's a really interesting one. And I think the difficulty is around the word, what counts? Are they the same thing? Is it, is reading a hardcover equivalent to listening to an audiobook? Are you going to get the exact same, mental impression, memory of the book? No, I don't believe that. And I think that's actually the value of audiobooks and of hardcovers. I like to do both. It absolutely counts in the sense that you're absorbing a narrative and you're engaging with a narrative in a similarly active brain process. You're not seeing a moving picture in front of you, so your brain still has to put the pieces together of an image of whatever story you're being told. A lot of people say to me, I just can't focus when I listen to an audiobook. I just stop listening and then I realize, minutes later I have to go back. And I just say, I do that with hardcovers all the time. I realize my eyes have glazed over the past 4 pages and I have to go back. And so I think attention is attention, absorption is absorption. If it's interesting to you, if you're invested in the story, yeah, it counts.
Lauren, you've been covering audiobooks at the New York Times since 2017. How has it's not a genre, how has the medium changed in that time?
I started here in 2017 and I was covering audiobooks, also hardcovers as well. And, it's funny you said the word genre because it was kind of treated like that in 2017. Maybe we were thinking about it as a kind of category of books. 2017 was not that long ago. In the years since then, I mean, I don't know that I can give you an exact financial figures, but my understanding is year over year, it's been the fastest growing sector of book publishing. And so just by and large, the most growth in the literary world is happening in audiobooks. What we may have just thought of as genre-like in 2017 is now a huge industry in and of itself. And so I think we're not just seeing audiobooks as certain stories that you're consuming. Everything is in audio right now. I shouldn't say everything. There are many books that you go and you look and they haven't made an audiobook out of it, but it does feel more and more like the exception rather than the rule. And so it really is, I don't want to say it's like the difference between reading a hardcover and an e-reader, because that actually is just format, but it's analogous to me in the sense that there are all these different options that we now have to consume every story that there is out there. So it's just become a much more overwhelming job is what I'm saying.
I'm glad we have one person doing it, and that person is you.
Doing my best.
Tina, how long have you been listening to audiobooks for?
So it's been a while, and I actually had to struggle to remember when I first started. And it was when the Harry Potter books were coming out and being narrated by Jim Dale, I think his name was, and they're phenomenal audiobooks. And we got one for like a summer car trip. My kids were 8 and 10 or whatever. And there was like not a peep, not a backseat fight, nothing. Like we were all silent, the 500 miles to Deer Isle. And that, I think, really opened my eyes to what a great audiobook could be. And I think Lauren will corroborate this, but even certainly in 2017 or 10 years ago or however long I was doing this, it was harder to find a really good audiobook. There were tons of them, but they weren't necessarily hiring terrific readers for them, for example. And so it was easy to get disillusioned.
How do you find the difference in listening to fiction and nonfiction, Lauren, when it comes to audiobooks?
I don't really so much distinguish. I mean, just in those broad categories like that. I mean, there are definitely narratives that I think work really well in audio, and there are narratives that I think work terribly in audio, and it doesn't really, in my opinion, line up with the fiction-nonfiction binary. But when you just said that, I was thinking about the Zadie Smith recording of her most recent novel, The Fraud, and it's an audiobook I really love, and I can get into that. The plot, it moves, and there are a lot of different sections, and the time frame jumps, and there are stretches that will introduce a lot of characters within, 15 minutes of listening. And if I happen to be listening while I walk the dog and I ran into someone and I missed, I would really have to go back. Otherwise, I would be totally lost in that book. So, fiction, nonfiction, I'm not sure it matters so much. To me personally, I don't find that I can focus on one better than the other. It's really just, is this narrator making this interesting? And the writer, of course.
So let's talk a little bit about narrators, because I feel like that is the thing that really can make or break an audiobook. Tina, do you have thoughts on what makes a good narrator versus just a sort of middling narrator versus what makes a bad narrator?
Well, what makes a good narrator when it comes to fiction is somebody who's really engaging deeply with the actual text and not somebody who's trying to act out a book. Like, I think those are two separate things. We've all talked about famous celebrity narrators, and I think we'll probably talk more about them here. But the ones that really work, I'm thinking, for example, of, I believe it's Meryl Streep reading Charlotte's Web. She's not acting. She is just in that book, and so are you when you're listening. As far as nonfiction goes, that's a little harder. I know a good nonfiction narrator when I'm listening to one, and that's somebody who can make me understand something that I struggled with understanding when I was trying to read it on the print page, like science books especially. I had a recent experience trying to listen to a book that was group biography of some philosophers, and I couldn't read it on the printed page, and I couldn't listen to it either. So I just struck out both ways.
Sometimes the story is just the story, and you're not going to connect with it in any medium.
Right.
So there's that. I have so many thoughts on this. I think that one very specific issue that I sometimes have with audiobook narrators, and this, I guess, applies to fiction and nonfiction, so I'm not sure it's really answering your question, but I'm thinking of a specific nonfiction book. But when a character does a certain accent, especially if it is foreign and, the character is speaking, well, it's translated into English, obviously, for us to be able to, for English readers to understand it, but the narrator will speak that dialogue in a foreign accent. Why? I mean, there are just certain, but those things matter and they can really take you out of it, but sometimes regional dialects work. And so it's a very, that I find, I mean, I don't know, maybe there's an essay there, but why certain accents, modes of speech pull me in or take me out of the narrative. That's something that I find is really, really matters.
Well, let's go back to Zadie Smith for one second, because
that's a great example.
She does the regional dialects in that novel in her voice, and it's kind of genius, right?
Yes, and I think so much of that, because that book is satire, and the tone is always, there's just so much irony already. So, she's asking you to kind of laugh at these people sometimes in some cases. And I think the accent just is kind of one more layer on top of that. There's no across the board is an accent helpful or not, but it is an element that you obviously don't have on a page. It is really interesting to think about how different acting is, right? Like stage acting or screen acting versus reading a book. I mean, you still want to feel like someone is reading a book to you, right? If I wanted to go see a movie right now, I would go see a movie, or if I wanted to go see a play. And so there is something about when Meryl Streep reads, or when Sissy Spacek reads To Kill a Mockingbird, which I know is one we both love.
We both love that, yeah.
You've seen Sissy Spacek act, but this is something different. She's embodying a kind of a narrator's persona, and that is a really difficult needle to thread. It's obviously an art, not a science. I've never done it. So,
right.
You just know when it works and when it doesn't.
It's like I said, it's not acting.
Yeah.
And it's not choosing what words to emphasize from an actor's point of view. You're having to be inside the text.
Right.
For those of you who don't listen to this show every week, I urge you, speaking about Zadie Smith and her new novel, The Fraud, to listen to last week's episode in which she discussed the writing of that book, and she also touched on very briefly what it meant to narrate, to read her entire book out loud. It's quite a good listen. We'll be right back. Welcome back. I'm Gilbert Cruz, and I'm here with Lauren Christensen and Tina Jordan, and we're talking all things audiobooks. Before I get into a few questions, I have to bring something up that happened recently at a book review meeting when one of our colleagues, and granted, this is the time of year when we're trying to get through a lot of books because we're talking about what books are going to be on our 10 best books of the year, and so we're just crushing so many books. And this one editor, God bless them, said that they listened to a recent book, the audiobook version of it, on 1.8 speed.
I cannot.
And this person honestly had some of the most cogent points in the entire discussion. So I cannot say that they lost anything in the listening of a book at almost twice the speed at which it was narrated. Lauren, do you listen to books a little bit faster than?
I do not listen at 1.8. But I don't listen at 1.0.
Okay, because I do. And as soon as he said that, I thought I am the biggest idiot in the world. I've wasted so much time.
Depends. Yeah. I mean, I think so. First of all, I'm sure I'm not in the recording studios, but I have to think sometimes when I listen at 1.0, someone is telling them to speak at just like they're in mud or something. I mean, it is so slow sometimes. And so sometimes I think it's actually 1.25 is just normal. But I guess I will say with certain books, I mean, if something is funny, for example, or really poignant and sad, timing matters. For an emotion to hit, for a joke to land, timing does matter. So I can imagine a voice sounding annoying at 1.8, probably, whoever's voice it is. But yeah, I mean, I think there are certain books, if it's going to be just very data dense, or if it's just 900 pages and life is too short, I don't know, speed it up, whatever.
Perhaps I should have listened to the Obama autobiography a little bit faster.
He reads it, right?
He reads it. It was great reading, but I remember getting on the elliptical many times during the first year of the pandemic, was it? And putting that on. And it's very long. It's very long. I could have moved through that faster. Tina, do you listen to audiobooks at a higher speed?
I do. I occasionally do 1.25. I mean, there are exceptions. If somebody, I don't think I sped up the Zadie Smith, for example.
No.
If I'm loving it and it isn't, as Lauren says, slow as mud and I want to luxuriate in it, I'm listening to it at 1.0. Also, the harder a book is to understand, the harder it is to speed up. And so I know this book in question that my colleague listened to at 1.8. And I'm just in awe because I struggled at 1.0.
Another editor on the desk, Liz Egan, was previously on the podcast, and she talked about, this is very behind the scenes book review stuff here, listeners. She talked about doing the double dip, as she calls it, which is she's reading a book at home, and then she's like, all right, I got to walk to the train, and so I'll find that spot in the audiobook version, and then I'll listen to it as I'm walking to the train, then get back on the train, and I'm reading the book again, and then so she's always consuming.
I loved that tip, by the way. I first heard of it from her, and I did it with a very long book. And I will say I probably read 75% of it, but I had a deadline to finish it. And it does work. You just have to end at a chapter, and you have to finish at a chapter.
Or you have to be using a Kindle with Whisper Sync, right?
Sure. But it works.
And you have to be getting your audiobooks through Audible, which is not the way that everyone gets their
Understood.
audiobooks. There are several other. There's Libro FM, which I've used. There's Libby, which I think syncs with your local library, and you can take audiobooks out through that if you support your local library, which you should, or else you're a bad person. Speaking of Liz Egan, one of the things that she wrote recently was in our Audiobook of the Week series. She reviewed an audiobook original, which was a memoir by the guy who was in The Martian, which I rewatched this week. Jeff Daniels. Yes. We've seen a spike in audiobook originals over the past many years, many of them from Audible, which is, one of the biggest players in the market. Do you have any thoughts on why that has happened and whether or not it's good or bad for audiobooks?
In terms of whether that's good, yeah. I mean, it's just more narratives that I guess I can't speculate as to whether Jeff Daniels would have written a 300-page hardcover memoir. Maybe he would have. Maybe I actually don't even know if he has. But if people were otherwise not going to tell whatever story they are telling in an audio original, it's a great thing. I don't think people are consuming narratives in such an either or fashion. I really think the more the better.
Okay, so I have a question about this myself, which is audio originals often just seem like podcasts to me.
I mean, Jeff Daniels' memoir is like a CD. It's like what I want to call a chapter is like an episode that's maybe 6 minutes long or something. I mean, I agree.
So what is, and I ask this as someone who listens to a lot of podcasts as well, at a certain point, is there a meaningful difference between these two formats, these two medium?
I find that such an interesting question. I don't listen to a lot of podcasts. I have actually kind of recently started listening to podcasts, which is pretty funny.
Because you're listening to so many audiobooks.
I think so. And I need something, some narrative in my ear at all times. I mean, there's a wide range of podcasts, right? I mean, there's what we're doing right now is not a book, right? Like what we're, sitting and talking without any kind of editing I shouldn't say without any editing, but you know what I'm saying.
There's so much editing.
Off the cuff conversations, right? Just between colleagues or podcast hosts. That's obviously a very different thing from reading, Anna Karenina. But I think if there is a kind of blurring of that distinction, it is coming from the production side. It's not coming from, the way we consume stories. I think more and more, now that Spotify is starting to offer audiobooks as well as songs, I mean, just the kind of conflation of just everything that goes into your ear being under a similar umbrella is a really interesting position for the consumer to be in. Because then you're not just thinking, oh, should I read this bestseller or this classic novel, you're thinking, okay, I have a 30-minute walk to wherever I'm going. Do I want to listen to this book? Do I want to listen to this podcast? Do I want to listen to this new album that came out? These kinds of questions of consumption, I think, are really fascinating. The bottom line is, I think if something is edited, I think it's a question of the editing that goes into books, because that is really, as we know really well, like the time that goes into crafting any book, fiction, nonfiction, just the publishing time span, the number of eyes on it, just the rigor of fact checking, right? Things like that. Those don't always apply to podcasts, but for some they do, right? And some podcasts are really heavily produced.
What you just said reminded me, when I was the TV editor a few years ago in the culture section, this thing that was happening with TV and movies, which is you got moving images that you could watch on your iPad, on your phone, on your TV, on your laptop. And at a certain point, the only thing that starts to distinguish visual content is how long is it? How is it broken up? Is it broken up into episodes? Is it 2 hours or longer? Then it's a movie. Is it shorter than this? Then it's a TV show. And the same decision has to be made. You get home at night and I have this much time. What am I doing with it? Am I watching 1/6 of Martin Scorsese's The Irishman, or am I watching an episode of Abbott Elementary?
But at the bottom of all of this is it's about the storytelling,
yes.
right? The oral storytelling tradition, which is way older than the print reading tradition. How well is the story told? That's what makes it work or not work.
Which also goes back to the original question of, like, does it count? Like, that's a great point. Like, oral storytelling was the original storytelling.
Right.
We couldn't write, when we were telling stories at first. So yes, it counts.
Big question. Hopefully you're prepared to answer this question. What are some of your favorites?
So I'm not going to say these are my all-time favorites because I can't. Yeah, you can't. Yeah, but these are the ones that came to my head first. The first one is definitely Maybe You Should Talk to Someone by Lori Gottlieb. I think actually it does speak to what we were just talking about in terms of episode podcast structure, because the book is about a therapist, or it's narrated by a therapist, and she's talking about, I can't remember if it's it's called 3 different patients she has and their stories. And it does feel episodic. It's like a TV show with different stages, and you're kind of returning to the different ones. And of course, there are common threads throughout. And it is so beautifully done. It is read by Brittany Presley, who is if you're listening to audiobooks, you've probably listened to one read by Brittany Presley. She's like one of the celebrity audiobook narrators. And another one that I really loved was Anna Karenina. I think I brought up Anna Karenina before. Maggie Gyllenhaal really hits that sweet spot. Obviously, she knows how to act for the screen, but she reads Tolstoy like she wrote it. I mean, she really feels the literary heft of this book. And I think I can't imagine how hard that was to sustain over something like 46 hours. It is really long. And that is actually a book that I never read and was like, I don't think I'm going to sit down and read that. So I listened, and it was beautiful. This is a more recent book. It is called Blood Orange Night. It is a memoir by this woman named Melissa Bond. She reads it, which is something I really love when an author reads their own memoir. I think if they can do it, if they have a voice that is compelling enough, I think it's a great move, because you just get the tone that the author intended, and you feel like less is lost. It's just, there's less of a mediation between you and the kind of intimate narrative that you're reading. But this is about a woman's addiction to benzodiazepines, and my God, I left this book just terrified. It really, it got to me. I mean, it felt like my friend was telling me this harrowing experience that she'd had. And I just, walked away like feeling like I really knew this person, like, the kind of parasocial relationship. I think that's another measure of a good narrator, is like this kind of intimacy that they create, in your ear. So that's another one I really recommend.
I totally agree with what you say about a narrator reading their own memoir. I've mentioned it on this podcast before, but John le Carré reading The Pigeon Tunnel, which is his memoir that, interestingly enough, has been made into a documentary series by Errol Morris that's going to be on Apple TV Plus later this fall, is great. He reads it. He's read it when he was older. He's very British. He's old. It's a book about an older British man looking back on his life. The tones, the anger, the wistfulness. It's great. It's great. And I would urge anyone who's into that author to give it a shot. Tina, what about you?
Lauren mentioned this earlier, but one of the first audiobooks I loved, and the one that I give to people who are not certain that they will like audiobooks, is Sissy Spacek reading To Kill a Mockingbird. And if you can imagine her Southern drawl, it is slow. She so embodies this book. It's not overacted. I don't know. I just found it, I couldn't stop listening.
Oh, one more. Toni Morrison reads Beloved.
Oh, right.
Wait, really?
That's a great one.
I don't think I knew
And her
that.
like gravelly voice, it is amazing.
Yeah. That's another great one.
Yeah, great is a good word for that one. That is a solid final recommendation. I urge all of our listeners to check out our Audiobook of the Week feature, which publishes at nytimes.com every Friday. And hopefully you're inspired to listen to something that you wouldn't have thought of to listen to before. Lauren, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Tina, I feel like when I introduced you, it was very lackluster. You're the best. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks, Gilbert.
That was my lively conversation with Lauren Christensen and Tina Jordan, two editors here, about all things audiobooks. I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. Thanks for listening.